"Your Honor, don't condemn the wrong man. I know the truth," shouted a blind little girl as she stormed into the courtroom. The air in the courtroom was thick, almost like smoke. Nobody dared to cough, shift in their seat, or even blink too hard. Every eye was fixed on the man in the dark suit, handcuffed and silent, sitting before the court. Mateo Arantes. The billionaire splashed across headlines, the magnate of luxury enterprises, now accused of killing his own wife. Judge Evaristo Menezes, stern-faced, with deep-set eyes and a voice unhurried, was reading the partial verdict. The prosecutor had already ended her speech with a line that hammered in everyone's ears. "Just because he's rich doesn't mean he's above the law. Mr. Arantes is not a victim, he is the murderer." To his left, Renata Vasconcelos, the mother-in-law, cloaked in black from neck to toe, sniffled from time to time, as if she knew exactly the right moments to seem devastated. Each sniff, each tear, was a reminder that she was the mother of the murdered woman, and that the man sitting in the defendant's chair was supposedly the monster behind it. The evidence spoke with brutal clarity. A vial of cyanide found in the mansion itself, covered with Mateo's fingerprints. An audio recording from a couple's fight, in which he said, "This ends tonight." Lorena's body, cremated quickly after burial, but not before toxicology reports revealed cyanide poisoning. And the final detail: Mateo had allegedly poured the drink. The defense was missing, literally. Mateo's lawyer had vanished the night before trial. No warning, no note, no trace. The police were searching, without success. The judge, aware of the case's gravity and the absence of official defense, allowed the trial to proceed under extraordinary circumstances. The prosecution, of course, did not object. And Mateo? He remained silent. From day one of the trial, he hadn't uttered a single word. Some thought it was guilt, others arrogance. For the press, it was just another convenient mystery, the billionaire in free fall. The silence broke with an unexpected sound, light footsteps, accompanied by the sharp tap of a cane. From the back of the room emerged an improbable figure, a frail little girl, dirty, dressed in worn clothes and eyes that could not see. Blind. The crowd took time to realize whether this was real or some kind of performance. But the girl kept moving forward, steady, until she stood before the judge. She asked to speak. She didn't shout, didn't beg. She simply positioned herself with a disconcerting certainty. The judge hesitated. The prosecution protested. The public reacted with outrage, but she did not waver. She said her name was Isadora and claimed she was there to defend Mateo. The judge nearly ordered her removed. But something, perhaps the silent authority of someone who had grown up ignored, made him hold back. He granted her a few minutes, just that, and Isadora used every second with precision. She declared she knew about the fraud, that Mateo was innocent, and that Lorena was not dead. The already tense courtroom froze. Renata shot to her feet, eyes wide in shock or panic. The prosecution demanded the girl be removed for contempt. But Isadora, with a low and steady voice, explained she lived in São Damião Cemetery, slept among graves, and one rainy night she overheard something no one should have heard. Familiar voices, dark plans, a conspiracy. She asked for two things: permission to question the medical examiner, Pablo Andrade, and authorization to exhume Lorena's body. That very night, the prosecution exploded with denials. Renata screamed, calling the girl a liar. But the judge, experienced as he was, caught the detail almost everyone missed. The medical examiner, calm until then, was now sweating silently. Evaristo struck the gavel. In the name of reasonable doubt, and given the absence of defense, Isadora's requests would be granted. There would be an exhumation, and Pablo would be interrogated. Mateo, until then a ghost of himself, lifted his eyes for the first time since the trial began. For the first time in weeks, something stirred inside him. A spark of life, hope. Isadora didn't ask for applause. She didn't look at anyone. She simply lowered her head, as if she already knew the game was turning, and that there was still much more to come. No news crew followed to Saint-Damien Cemetery that night. The press was still fixated on the scandal of the trial, trying to understand how a blind girl from the streets had managed to postpone the possible conviction of a billionaire. Few knew that, while the city slept, something even more disturbing was unfolding among the tombstones and ancient graves. Judge Evaristo's authorization for the exhumation had been swift, almost impulsive, but the signature was on paper and the officials were present. When Lorena's coffin was raised and opened, there was no drama, only silence. A silence far more devastating than screams. The coffin was empty. The smell was of damp wood and soil. No sign of decomposition, no human remains, no tissue, only a pillow lying at the bottom and a torn lining in the left corner, as if someone had left or been removed. The expression on medical examiner Pablo Andrade's face shifted at the discovery. He said nothing, but his eyes gave everything away. The shock wasn't surprise, it was the fact that it had come to light at all. The mask of neutrality fell, revealing something much deeper: guilt. The court officials exchanged glances. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a conspiracy. And now there was physical proof. While the empty coffin defied the official version of death, Isadora walked alone through one of the cemetery's narrow paths, unhurried. Her cane tapped softly against the stone ground, guiding her steps. She didn't need sight to know where she was. Those passages, those nighttime voices, the smells and sounds, all were part of the territory where she had learned to survive. There, no one saw her, and that was exactly why she had heard everything. It had been on a stifling night, weeks before. It was raining, and the sound of heavy drops hitting the tomb roofs drowned out footsteps. She had sheltered behind the Vasconcelos mausoleum, as she did when she wanted quiet to sleep. But that night, 3 voices whispered in the dark. She recognized one immediately: Renata Vasconcelos, the mother of the supposedly dead woman. The other 2 came later, one deep, slow, careful, which she would only associate with the medical examiner Pablo Andrade days later. And a third, rasping, impatient, calling Renata Madam again and again: Norberto, the thug. They opened the grave with tools, working quickly. Isadora stayed still, breathing slowly. She heard the sound of soil being moved, ropes pulling the coffin up. Then came something she would never forget: the lid opening and a laugh. Lorena, alive. What followed was a plan spoken aloud. The staged death, the faked poisoning, the falsified report, the lawyer bribed to vanish, everything carefully orchestrated. The goal: to frame Matteo, seize his assets, freeze his wealth, and split the inheritance between Lorena and Renata. Norberto would be paid in money and silence. Pablo would be rewarded with more than love. He would be a partner in power. Isadora didn't move. She told no one. Who would believe her? A blind street girl, undocumented, claiming to have heard a dead woman laughing in a cemetery. Justice didn't listen to invisible voices, but she listened and memorized. When Matteo appeared in the papers, arrested and silent, she knew. It was now or never. If no one stood for him, she would. Because truth, for those living on the margins, is the only thing you cannot afford to lose. The next morning, news of the exhumation leaked to the press. The story of the empty coffin exploded like a bomb. Headlines changed tone in an instant. Matteo, from murderer to victim. Cemetery mystery. Where is Lorena? Blind girl may have changed the case of the year. In court, Judge Evaristo watched the reports with a furrowed brow. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but something in this case unsettled him. The girl, the exhumation, the missing body, and now Pablo's increasingly erratic behavior. It was time to put him back on the witness stand. This time, Isadora didn't ask. She simply stood by the judge and waited. Permission came in silence. Pablo sat under the cold lights, eyes lowered. The girl didn't press him with questions. She simply described, with a disturbingly calm tone, the night at the cemetery. She detailed each voice, each phrase, each decision whispered. And then she asked if he preferred to confirm it or have security recordings from around the cemetery requested. It was a bluff. She knew there were no cameras, but he didn't know that. The examiner broke. Head bowed, he murmured what many had already suspected. He had had an affair with Renata. She convinced him to falsify the report. He had claimed the cause of death was poisoning, even without a proper autopsy. Lorena had never been dead. The impact was devastating. The judge withdrew for a few minutes. When he returned, he ordered Renata to be taken into immediate custody for questioning. The same for Pablo, now officially under investigation for forensic fraud. A search and seizure warrant was issued, and, based on Isadora's testimony, a specific location was marked as priority. A remote property in the mountains, discreetly owned by an old acquaintance of the Vasconcelos family. Police set out that same afternoon. Mateo, still in handcuffs, looked at the girl before him. He still didn't know who she was, where she came from, or why she was doing all this. But he saw in her something his money had never bought until then: true courage, raw integrity, and for the first time, living justice. She didn't need eyes to see what was wrong. While the city buzzed with rumors, the isolated property where Lorena was hiding was surrounded by authorities. She tried to escape through the back door, but was captured before reaching the woods. She didn't scream. She didn't resist. She only muttered that everything had gotten out of control. Inside the house, documents, packed suitcases, fake passports, and part of the diverted money already in cash. The story of the perfect widow was collapsing, and with it, the empire of lies built around Mateo's downfall. The courtroom was different now. The tide had turned, and at the center of the upheaval, without seeking applause, stood a girl society had chosen not to see. But she listened, always listened. And now, the whole world was beginning to hear her too. The city was still reeling from the shock. Lorena Vasconcelos was alive, hidden away on a farm, with everything ready for an international escape. The perfect widow, once a symbol of tragedy that had moved public opinion, was now exposed as a conspirator in a plot to destroy her own husband. And at the center of the upheaval was not an experienced detective nor a renowned lawyer. It was Isadora, a blind, orphaned, homeless girl. But the truth that surfaced had not come from a miracle, nor from luck. It had grown from the place where no one looks, from the silence between the graves, from the listening of someone ignored by all, who had learned to decipher the world through sounds and the spaces between them. The rain had fallen hard that night. Saint-Damien Cemetery looked older than ever. Slippery stones, soaked tombs, trees weighed down by water. Isadora searched for shelter, as she always did, and knew exactly where to curl up, behind the Vasconcelos mausoleum. There, a narrow gap between two structures offered protection from the wind and cold. She was just settling in when she heard footsteps. 2 pairs at first, heavy, deliberate, and silent, which was rare. People who walk without talking have something to hide. Then a voice, female, familiar, Renata. "Hurry, we don't have all night." Isadora held her breath. The woman was irritated, authoritative, and she wasn't alone. A man's voice followed, deep, anxious. "We should wait a little longer." "Wait for what? For the press to forget? For the body to rot?" More footsteps. The sound of something being dragged. A third voice, Lower, sarcastic. Not dead, remember? Won't stink anytime soon. Stifled laughter. Isadora heard the tools, an iron key turning, hinges creaking, levers being positioned. The mausoleum was opened from within, a compartment only the Vasconcelos family knew. They went down. She heard wood being pulled up from below, a coffin, the lid cracked open. And then, as if in an impossible nightmare, a fourth voice emerged, soft, alive, Lorena. Oh, for God's sake, it was hot as hell. Thought I was going to suffocate in there. She coughed and laughed, as though stepping out of a long bath, not a tomb. Isadora remained still. Her legs trembled, but her body refused to make a sound. Listening was all she had. The voices carried on. Renata commanded, gave orders. Lorena complained about the time she'd spent hidden. The sarcastic one, Norberto, cracked morbid jokes as he helped lift the empty coffin. And the hesitant one, worried about details, was Pablo, the medical examiner. They spoke of Matteo as if he were already beaten, explained how it had all been staged. The fight, the edited audio, the poisoned drink with cyanide which Lorena only pretended to swallow before collapsing, drugged with a substance that simulated death. The report, false from the beginning, had never been done on any body at all, just signed and submitted by Pablo. The vial with Matteo's fingerprints had been planted deliberately in the pantry. The scheme was almost complete. Matteo would be convicted, his fortune transferred to the sole heir, his wife. And with her dead, the inheritance would pass to Renata. Later, Lorena would resurface in another country, with a new name and guaranteed fortune. Only the lawyer was left, already paid to vanish and defend no one. Isadora memorized everything, every voice, every tone, every pause. And when they were gone, she waited another hour before moving. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just sat there, in silence, trying to understand why such an absurd truth had chosen to fall into the ears of an invisible girl. In the days that followed, she tried to tell someone, a cemetery worker, a policeman, a priest. But the moment they saw her dirty clothes, her cane, her age, she was dismissed. So she said nothing more, she waited. When Matteo was arrested, she recognized her chance to act. Even without a diploma, without credentials, without anything. She knew what she had heard, and she knew where the holes in the story were. Now, with Lorena in custody, Renata and Pablo under investigation, and Norberto on the run, the web was beginning to unravel. Evidence surfaced like fragments of a puzzle Isadora had already pieced together in her mind. At the farm, police found forged documents, records of financial transactions, receipts in other names. Lorena, cornered, tried to negotiate cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, but it was too late. The case was public, the humiliation irreversible. Renata was arrested as she left the prosecutor's office. She tried to look shocked, as if she were the victim of a setup, but the act was collapsing quickly. Pablo, under pressure, signed a deal to name the others and confirmed everything Isadora had revealed in court. The last to fall was Norberto. He tried to flee, but was found in a roadside motel. His suitcase was still open. Inside, along with cash and a passport, was Lorena's black scarf, with traces of cyanide. Matteo was released a week later. The case against him crumbled. The charges were formally withdrawn. But the damage was already done. Reputation tarnished, businesses paralyzed, public image destroyed. Even so, what weighed on him most was something else. He felt betrayed by someone he once loved. Lorena had not just deceived him, she had condemned him. And yet amid all the chaos, there was one figure he couldn't ignore, Isadora. He owed her nothing. And yet, he owed her everything. At the final hearing, Judge Evaristo summed up the case in few words, an example of how deeply justice can fail and how, surprisingly, it can rise again. He made a point of citing Isadora's courage in the court's official record. He said she had proven that seeing the truth doesn't require open eyes, but an awakened conscience. Matteo, silent, listened, and that very day he made a decision. He visited the shelter where Isadora had been taken after the trial. He brought with him an envelope containing the signed adoption request and a promise, not of wealth, but of a future, of family, of care. She accepted, without tears, without hesitation, not because she dreamed of it, but because she trusted the instinct that had always guided her, to listen before judging. And in Matteo's gesture, there was no pity, there was recognition. In the months that followed, Matteo funded the surgery to restore part of Isadora's sight. The procedure was complex but successful. She came to distinguish shapes, light, silhouettes, enough to walk with more independence, enough to look in the mirror and for the first time see herself as someone who existed. She returned to school, with obsession, with hunger, with rage, and with purpose. Her name was no longer a whisper in the courts. Isadora began defending people like her, invisible, disregarded, disbelieved. She became a symbol of unvarnished justice. And at her side, Matteo started over. But that part of the story belongs to the end. The courtroom lights did not illuminate only the faces of the defendants that morning. They seemed to cast light on everything that had been neglected until then. The lies, the interests, the corruption running rampant among those meant to uphold justice. But now, everyone was present, and no one could hide anymore. Renata Vasconcelos entered in handcuffs, wearing the same black mourning clothes she once wore on the news, now stained by public exposure. Pablo Andrade, the medical examiner, sat with his head bowed. Lorena, the fugitive wife, no longer wore heels or makeup. Norberto, the thug, still tried to keep his cynical demeanor, but his restless eyes revealed the fear of someone who knew what awaited him. And Matteo's original defense lawyer, the one who had disappeared at the crucial moment, was now escorted in under heavy guard. Bribed, bought, an essential part of the scheme. The prosecution did not sugarcoat anything. It was a national scandal. Multiple crimes, procedural fraud, falsified forensic evidence, asset seizure, obstruction of justice, attempted emotional and social homicide. But the core of that trial was not the crime itself. It was what it revealed: the fragility of the system, the ease with which someone could be condemned based on appearances, on the most convenient narrative, on the loudest voice. Judge Evaristo did not mince words. He declared that the case would become mandatory reference in law courses, an example of how truth can be buried under the weight of manipulation, and how, even then, it finds ways to emerge, even if through the ears of a blind girl. The sentences were severe. Renata received the longest, 22 years. Lorena, 18, Pablo and Norberto, 16 each. The corrupted lawyer, 12. All would be sent to different prisons, and all now belonged to oblivion, the place where truth had finally caught up with them. Matteo watched everything standing, a simple suit, grayer hair than before, quiet but attentive eyes. He was no longer the same man who had once sat in the defendant's chair. Arrogance had given way to something rarer, genuine humility. He knew that if Isadora hadn't appeared, he would have been condemned by a system he himself had always believed he controlled. At the end of the session, he said nothing to the press. He simply walked to the side door where Isadora waited. She could already see a little, enough to perceive him as a figure, a presence. They smiled without words. Months later, Matteo formalized the adoption. The paperwork was quick. He had resources, of course, but he didn't use them to rush anything. He wanted it all to be legitimate. Isadora didn't just become the daughter of the wrongly accused billionaire. She became someone with a name, a surname, an address, a school. She became someone officially belonging. The surgery to restore part of her sight took place in a specialized hospital in Switzerland. 2 months of rehabilitation. When she returned to Brazil, she could see in faded tones, fragments of light and form. The world was still imprecise, but now it had outlines. Darkness was no longer absolute. More important than that, she could see a future. Isadora studied voraciously. She read aloud, memorized easily. With the support of private tutors and the dedication of someone who knew the value of opportunity, within a few years she completed basic education, then high school, and eventually entered law school. Matteo, in turn, started over. He sold part of his businesses, left luxury circles behind, and began investing in social projects, especially community legal education. He discovered that rebuilding himself was possible, as long as he acknowledged how much he had once ignored the invisible. Eventually, he found love again. It wasn't a cinematic romance, nor a tabloid scandal. It was simple. An architect with a private life with whom he shared long conversations and short walks. Her presence didn't replace anything. It simply added. Years later, a new hearing filled the same courtroom. This time, the case was different. A young, homeless woman accused unjustly of stealing from a pharmacy. There was no solid evidence, only the same old prejudice. The defense attorney entered with firm posture, calm voice, and absolute confidence. Her name, Isadora Vasconcelos Arantes. It was her first big case, and she won. The press surrounded her as if discovering a new phenomenon. But to her, none of it was new. It was simply the continuation of a path that had begun behind a mausoleum, on a rainy night, listening to voices no one imagined could be heard. She refused interviews, but left behind a sentence that became a headline. Justice doesn't always have eyes, but it should never be deaf. Renata and Lorena remained imprisoned. They no longer received visitors. They were no longer remembered in society columns. The derogatory nicknames created by the press now followed them like tattoos on the skin of history. Pablo, after serving part of his sentence, was released under restrictions. He disappeared from public life, never practiced medicine again. Norberto also faded away, serving his time in silence, far from the spotlight. The corrupted lawyer lost his license and, they say, now lives under another name, ashamed of his own biography. But none of them mattered anymore. The true legacy left by this story wasn't money, nor the downfall of the guilty. It was the transformation that began in a dark, stifling, ignored place. The cemetery where a blind girl heard what no one wanted to hear. Where truth, buried beneath lies and vile intentions, found a crack through which to rise. Isadora became more than a lawyer. She became a symbol, a defender of the invisible. Someone who didn't seek the spotlight, but justice. Someone who knew firsthand what it meant to be ignored by a system blind to some and cruel to others. Matteo remained her father by choice. He didn't try to be a mentor or a hero, just a presence, and that was enough. He learned to find value where once he had only seen statistics. He discovered in Isadora's half-clear gaze a strength no money could buy. And if someone were to ask today who saved Matteo, the answer would be simple. It wasn't the law, nor luck. It was a street girl without a diploma, without a surname, without sight, but with enough courage to face an entire courtroom with her eyes open. And there, true justice began, blind, without a degree, and living in a cemetery. Would you have listened to Isadora or turned your face away like everyone else? Comment, like, and subscribe if you still believe courage can change destinies.